I'm Lee C. Camp. This is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life.
Their goal is to make the thing stickier. And they know that one of the best ways to do that is to hack your psychology.
This is part 2 of our 2-part series, The Human Cost of AI.
These technologies are very, very powerful. And what we're building with them is speeding along tracks that we can't quite see until something has gone wrong.
In part 1, we discussed the forces behind an AI revolution that is shaping the ways we think, feel, behave, from the public square to our most intimate relationships. So, how should we navigate the brave new world in which we find ourselves? Some potential answers coming right up.
It doesn't have will or agency or telos, but as soon as you pick it up, the design of that tool shapes your will and agency in a certain direction.
Hello friends, Lee C. Camp here. If you enjoy the kinds of conversations we have here on No Small Endeavor about ideas, culture, and how we might make sense of the world, there's another show you might appreciate. It's called The Gist with Mike Pesca. The Gist is the longest running daily news podcast, and each weekday Mike takes about 30 minutes to examine the stories shaping our moment. What makes the show interesting is that it resists the usual partisan scripts. Mike brings on economists, historians, journalists, and other thinkers to look at issues from multiple angles. One day he might unpack the dynamics of a major political story. Another day he might explore the psychology behind public outrage, or why we humans are so quick to believe strange things. Mike's an award-winning journalist whose work has appeared in outlets like The Atlantic, The Free Press, and The Washington Post. His approach combines careful reporting with a sharp sense of humor and a willingness to question assumptions wherever they come from. If you're someone who likes thoughtful inquiry and conversations that challenge easy answers, give The Gist a listen. You can find The Gist every weekday on YouTube or follow wherever you get your podcasts.
Are you curious about the hidden side of everything? Then I have a podcast for you. I'm Stephen Dubner, host of Freakonomics Radio. Each week we hear from some of the most fascinating scholars and thinkers as we tackle big topics like how whales became the face of environmental activism, how to succeed at failing, and whether public transportation should be free. Go ahead, listen to Freakonomics Radio wherever you get your podcasts.
Across the globe, researchers are finding that increased social media use is affecting people's happiness. So, why do so many of us feel like we can't log off, even when we want to? The Happiness Lab podcast is going straight to the source. Host Dr. Laurie Santos sits down with the authors of the 2026 World Happiness Report to unpack this year's most significant and surprising findings. From global trends in young people's well-being to the social pressures that keep the rest of us glued to our feeds, Dr. Santos breaks down the science in ways that could change how you use these platforms. I'm a longtime fan of the work of Professor Laurie Santos, professor at Yale. I've used her work for years in some of my own classes, and I happily recommend her podcast. Again, it's called The Happiness Lab, and you can listen to The Happiness Lab wherever you get your podcasts now. I'm Lee C. Camp. This is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. This is part 2 of our 2-part series, The Human Cost of AI. We began this series with a line from the philosopher Paul Virilio: "When you invent the ship, you also invent the shipwreck." The ship changes the course of human history, and yet it brings in its wake grave loss, unforeseen devastation, and so it is with many technologies in the course of human history. So last week we sought to anticipate, at a minimum, some of the potential shipwrecks which may be arising already from AI. Today in part 2, quite modestly, we offer some potential practices which might keep us from some of the potential devastation of the new age of AI. Maybe not even full-blown practices, as much as a set of questions. What posture, what dispositions might train us to navigate the potential storms on the horizon? The questions we examine in today's episode: first, why? Why use these so-called tools? For what purpose and in what way? Second, what does it mean to be human? Third, what is within our power? First, the question, why? Remember Thomas Merton's observation, one may spend their whole lives climbing the ladder of success only to discover at the end that the ladder was leaning against the wrong wall. Combine Merton's observation with Mark Zuckerberg's supposed tech bro wisdom that innovation in the digital age requires one to move fast and break things. With that combination, what do you get? A vision of someone furiously rushing up a supposed ladder of success very, very efficiently, and yet at the end, potentially realizing they've broken not only a life, but a community, a culture, the common good. In other words, we must always begin with the end in mind, or alternatively put, we could move deliberately, even slowly if necessary, and seek to heal, restore, and repair.
I was building technology to give computers the ability to see and label emotional expressions.
That's MIT professor and founder of the Affective Computing Research Group, Rosalind Picard. There, Roz is talking about a wearable, a piece of equipment she and her lab at MIT developed to pick up and identify emotion. It uses strategically placed electrodes and multimodal machine learning.
One day, one of the young undergrads in my lab came and knocked on my door right before the Christmas break, and he said, "My little brother has autism and he can't talk. Can I borrow one of your sensors to take home to see what's stressing him out?" Because by that point, we had moved all the wires and electrodes into little packages that you could wear under a sweatband in your wrist. So I'm back looking at the boy's data at MIT, and I saw in it, on the first day, the kid looked like he was pretty relaxed. I thought, wow, okay, so much for the theory of autism just having super high stress all the time. This particular physiological signal that measured skin conductance that goes up with sympathetic fight or flight response, it was pretty low. And it was low the next day. And I flipped to the next day, and my jaw dropped. It was the biggest signal I'd ever seen in my life. And I remember kind of screwing up my courage to call the student at home on vacation, because I've never bothered a student at home on vacation. And I picked up the old-fashioned telephone and called him. "Hi, how's your Christmas? How's your little brother? Hey, do you have any idea what happened to the data?" And I gave him the exact date and time. And I thought, this is a teenage boy. What are the odds that he's going to remember? And he comes back and he has the exact date and time, and he says, "That was right before my little brother had a grand mal seizure." Thus began more just-in-time learning, which included screwing up my courage again to make a phone call to another student's dad, who is a neurosurgeon of epilepsy surgery over in Children's Hospital Boston. So he cuts open kids' heads to remove regions of the brain that have unusual electrical activity that are causing a lot of seizures. And Joe Madsen said, "That's really interesting. Why don't we add your sensors to this study I have?" So soon we had 80 people around the clock in the seizure monitoring ward with EEG on their scalp, our sensors on their wrists, and the ECG on their gold standard video, doctors labeling seizures. And we realized that in 100% of the grand mal seizures, we had a very significant response with the wrist.
So then that has then turned into, I presume, a wearable that a lot of people are benefiting from.
Yeah, we soon learned that those kind of seizures can kill people. It's actually the largest cause of death in epilepsy is in the minutes afterwards, when it looks like the seizures ended, but the person can progress to a state of not breathing. And if somebody is there in that moment to stimulate you, reposition you, make sure there's nothing in your airway, you have a more than 5 times higher chance of surviving this apneic episode that is associated with what's called sudden unexpected death in epilepsy, or SUDEP.
I think I read that you have heard from families that sometimes get these alerts and they find their child or sibling and they turn them over and they live, and they otherwise would have died.
Yeah, these still make my heart pound and my skin sweat thinking about these. The first one was one morning, I was checking my email, and a mom who was testing the first version of the Empatica Embrace device at the time before it had FDA clearance. She had put her daughter to bed. She went to take a shower. Her phone was on the counter next to her in the shower, and the phone goes off while she's in the shower saying her daughter might be having a seizure. So she runs to the daughter's bedroom, finds her face down in bed, blue, the color of your jacket, not breathing, and flips her over. And her daughter takes another breath, and her color is restored.
So perhaps Professor Picard's approach might give us some clues as to how to approach this new world with slow deliberation, curiosity, seeking to heal, protect, repair. If you're a regular listener to our show, you'll know I've been influenced significantly by the French sociologist Jacques Ellul. Ellul insisted that the reigning dogma of the modern world was what he called technique. He defined technique as means and the ensemble of means without regard to ends. In other words, do it faster, more quickly, more efficiently, and do so without ever asking why, or for what purpose, or to what end. Ellul was not particularly hopeful on this matter. He believed that technique would be an acid that would eat away at all forms of community, tradition, faith, or even political affiliation or philosophy. For Ellul, asking why and to what end is not just a good idea. It may be the only way we get out of all this alive. But even before we begin catastrophizing, it's easy to see the importance of his contention in the smallest of ways.
If you think about today, we are quite obsessed with moving things quickly, right? We equate speed with efficiency.
That's Carissa Carter from the Stanford Design School, co-author with Scott Dorley of the book Assembling Tomorrow.
If you think of any app that you have, it's like trying to make your life faster and better and easier, quicker, more efficient. And that's not necessarily true. And, what that says to us is that there's this desire to compute faster, to make things better, to make things easier, but it's not really making our lives easier, right? So we're moving data faster, but are we moving it the right way? Like, are we using it the way that we want to that's really making our lives better? Like, that's the question, the discussion we'd love to even have.
If we have that view that all these technologies are a tool, and when we use a tool, we're kind of offloading something that we do to that tool. So like if I drive a car, I'm offloading my motion to the car. I think we need to be really careful about what we're offloading. Like I might be okay offloading my sense of direction because the maps just make it so easy to traverse through the world that I can think about other things. I can pay attention to my kids rather than trying to find directions. But, am I okay with offloading my creativity to a generative AI that can write? Maybe in cases where I don't feel like that creativity is really core to my being, maybe that's okay. But in other cases, maybe not. And as we just say, tool to fix problem, we forget what the core is that we've developed to work on that problem and what we're losing, what we're offloading from our character.
I mean, there's also, like, if I could just build even beyond that, Scott mentioned the maps example. There's research that shows it's not just our character that might be adjusted, but our hippocampus has shrunk. If you never use your sense of direction, that affects the actual structure of your brain. Are we okay with that too? I think that when we're talking now about offloading that creativity or other characteristics that we might be asking machines to do, both for our characters and our psyches, but also like our bodies, is that actually having physiological changes that could be harmful down the line?
To say it again in slightly different fashion, okay, efficient, but why? What do we plan to do with all of that time we supposedly save?
Think about washing the dishes by hand versus using a dishwasher.
That's computer scientist Josh Brake, whom we heard in our previous episode. He's a professor at Harvey Mudd College in Southern California.
Dishwasher is more efficient, but I think you can make a case to say, well, where are you using the time and the energy that you would have spent washing the dishes now that you're using the dishwasher? I think in our best visions, we think about using the dishwasher so that we can spend more time with our kids. But I think the challenge, which, again, I find myself falling into in many ways, is more often than not, I'm drawn into something else that likely is probably worse for me than washing the dishes by hand. I'm just scrolling my phone or doing some more work or something, that answering more email, whatever. And not that any of those things are necessarily bad, but I think we do have to ask this question, again, not only as what is it for, but as we think about in practice, when we replace that thing with a more efficient means, it does create a certain vacuum Oftentimes when you open up that vacuum, if you're not very quick to fill it with something that's better, it gets filled with something that's worse. And I think this is the human condition. The problem with any sort of efficient replacement is not what is this replacing for me, but when it becomes more efficient, when I outsource that task, what am I replacing it with? And I think this, again, ties directly into, as we think about artificial intelligence and how it's going to propagate throughout so many of our workplaces and the things that we're doing, we need to be asking not just like, okay, great, this is more efficient, but how are we using this to reshape what we're doing?
AI could be used to accelerate, to augment, to accommodate. Each of those represents a choice.
That's cultural commentator and host of the podcast Life with Machines, Baratunde Thurston. Baratunde's been explicitly asking the question of why and to what end, and has developed a framework that may provide a more intentional use of AI under the headings, as you heard, of accelerate, augment, and accommodate. One might ask, for example, what one wants to accelerate and what one does not want to accelerate.
Acceleration isn't good for everything. I don't want to accelerate mealtime. I like taking my time with my meals. I don't want to accelerate time with my wife. Mostly. Sometimes I want to get through this argument real fast. Come on, AI, bail me out. But let's choose. Let us not just receive higher speed from a Mark Zuckerberg type.
And one can ask what sorts of work we might augment.
A more fun one, I think, would be, what do we have to do that we don't want to do? And we all have that in our various roles. As a business owner and operator, I have to do bookkeeping and invoicing and taxes. I don't like doing any of that. Bring on the AI. Please displace that work from me. I'm inviting you to take that job off my hands. I come willingly. And I think that there is a level of excitable consent, jubilant consent, where in an employment context, in a worker context, you don't start with the CEO and the board looking at where we can save money. You start with the unions. You start with the worker special interest groups and employee interest groups. You start with committees and divisions and departments, and you ask people, what's the hardest part of your job that you've been struggling with? I'm here to help. I've got some AI with me. What's the most meaningless part of your job that's taken up outsized time and resources? If we could approach people with that, all of a sudden the threat is now an invitation to possibility, to more participation, to more power. And we can deliver on that real promise of letting people do the meaningful work. But you cannot promise to elevate people into meaningful work, and you're not even bothering to ask those people what meaningful work to them is. That's just a charade. That's a scam. And we can't tolerate that.
And one can ask what sorts of ways we might use AI to accommodate.
This is huge. Where can we use AI to accommodate participation by people who have been excluded from previous versions of our systems? That goes to language skills, to learning styles and neurodiversity. That goes to all the DEI things, all the inclusion things. That goes to geography and time zone. Like, there are so many beautiful ways that AI can help us include people and their valuable contributions and perspectives that just technically was harder before.
So here in segment 1, we've suggested that we keep asking the question, why? Why use these so-called tools? For what purpose? In what way? Coming up, another question to carry with us into the brave new world. What does it mean to be human? A special thank you to the Institute for Faith and Learning at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, for helping make this series on AI possible. I love hearing from you. Tell us what you're reading, who you're paying attention to, or send us feedback about today's episode. You can reach me at lee@nosmallendeavor.com. You can get show notes for this episode in your podcast app or wherever you listen. These notes include links to resources mentioned in the episode. You also can get unabridged interviews with all of the guests in this 2-part series. We would be delighted if you tell your friends about No Small Endeavor, invite them to join us on the podcast, because that helps extend the reach of the beauty, truth, and goodness we are seeking to sow in the world. Hello, friends. Lee Seacamp here. Do you ever wish you had more folks to discuss the conversations we offer on No Small Endeavor? Something like a podcast listening club where you could engage big ideas about what it means to live life well and then discuss it with friends and companions? If so, you have stumbled upon the announcement you have been waiting for. We're pleased to announce the start of Endeavor Together, our new initiative that equips and nurtures close-knit communities to talk about the things you actually want to talk about. Each small group conversation series is built upon our podcast content and provides you with super easy to use content with questions, videos, links, and guidance so that you or any good and willing soul can host small group conversations exploring what it means to live a good life. Maybe you'll meet in homes around a table, maybe in a coffee shop or local park, maybe at work during lunch hour, maybe in a church Sunday school class. What we are providing is the scaffolding for good conversation. The rest is up to you. And here's the best part. Thanks to generous support from the Lilly Endowment, it's free. The first two series have been released. The first, Let's Disagree Better, and the second, Vulnerability. Get started today. Visit nosmallendeavor.com and click on Endeavor Together. Again, go to nosmallendeavor.com and click on Endeavor Together. Enjoy. Today in this second episode, we're offering a few modest practices which might keep us from some of those shipwrecks. More like a set of questions, really. Some questions that can help us to pay attention well in this brave new world that is coming our way. Before the break, we suggested that we should be asking why. Why use these so-called tools? For what purpose? In what way? Toward what end? We move now to a second question that might help us navigate the storms potentially brewing on the horizon.
Well, people are wondering what it means to be human.
That's Rosalind Picard, esteemed computer scientist at MIT.
There's an existential crisis happening either silently in a lot of people and much more openly starting to be talked about, where people are saying, well, I thought it was language that separated us from machines, or I thought it was emotion that separated us from machines, or I thought it was some set of capacities that separate us from machines. And now machines are getting these incredibly impressive capacities. Some people are starting to feel like they have no worth because of this. One young woman who was applying for a job was told to use an AI to help her write her letter. She used it to write the letter. She said, it did such a good job with my letter that I realized it could do the whole job I was applying for better than I could. And now I don't even think I should apply for the job. And she fell into a state of depression. This is a tragedy for youth who are being told that AI is smarter than you.
So what does it mean to be human in the age of AI? Here, I'm not even going to begin to venture an answer to that question. I want to propose instead a more modest assertion, that we must be having sustained, rigorous conversation about that question, and especially around three subpoints: the dignity of humankind, the fact that we are embodied, and the necessity of human community. First, on the supposed dignity of humankind, on whether there is something inherently dignified, inherently worthy in being human. This contention is being challenged in our brave new world. Computers can now do, we're told, the supposed things that make us humans special: reason and language. So what are we to conclude? A lead executive in one of the world's largest tech companies once told me that we will increasingly have to give up our presumed sense of specialness. That was his word. But here's Roz Picard again, discussing an interview with the famed philosopher Peter Singer.
He believed he should not take care of his mother if she became old and suffered from dementia. In fact, she agreed with him in your utilitarian view that you should not take care of me. You can dispose of me. Don't worry about it. I share your utilitarian view. If I'm suffering more, I can't enjoy pleasure, just end my life. Well, when unfortunately she did come to that state late in life, he and his sister could not do what their philosophy said to do. Now, he has said he doesn't believe in God and in Imago Dei, but I think he treated his mom with Imago Dei when he realized that he could not end her life just because her brain wasn't working as well.
The theological language Roz uses here, imago Dei, the image of God, comes from the creation stories at the beginning of the book of Genesis, that humankind was created in the image of God. As you might expect, there's a great deal of debate among the theologians and scholars, Christian and Jewish alike, as to exactly what the so-called image of God even means. But one thing seems clear. This concept points to some sort of inherent dignity of all human beings. And in the brave new world, it's not so clear that this inherent dignity will be upheld or honored. Here's Roz again.
We have been leaning heavily on communities of Christian practice, other religious practice also. I think we have a lot to learn from great theological traditions. In particular, there's been a big push in AI to reduce bias in AI, right? Make sure that it's not affected by the color of your skin, or if you're male or female in job selection, or various other kinds of bias that our society by and large thinks, it shouldn't be practicing. But if you ask people where that came from, they're like, well, no, I don't know. Like, isn't it self-evident? They don't know that in ancient Rome, this was not the case.
Indeed, it was not the case in Rome or Greece or Babylon or in many hierarchical or supremacist cultures still in our own day. But it is a concern that must be foregrounded because the consequences of rejecting or downplaying the inherent dignity of all human beings will be vast and devastating. Under the broader question of what does it mean to be human in the age of AI, there is a second concern worth a great deal of continued discernment, namely the body.
I like to think about it as the Looney Tunes theory of personal identity.
That's philosopher Joe Vukov.
This is a little bit old-timey, but I watched some Looney Tunes as a kid, and it has still stuck around.
You seem too young to watch the Looney Tunes as a kid.
Yeah, I was maybe nostalgic as a little kid or something like that. But you'll see this, and this is in other things too, but in Looney Tunes especially, Sylvester the cat would always die. It was a very kind of morbid show in some ways. And whenever Sylvester would die, there would be this ghost Sylvester that then would rise up out of dead Sylvester and float up to heaven, presumably. Even if you don't watch Looney Tunes, that understanding of that's who you are has really stuck around, right? So what happens when I die, right, is this like marshmallowy kind of soul rises up out of me, and that's the real me. Again, maybe people don't have quite that cartoony of a view, but I think roughly a lot of people, especially religious people, think, no, that's the real Joe, is the one that's kind of the immaterial, translucent version of him. And I would argue that's a Gnostic view, because what that's saying is that matter, the body, doesn't matter, right? What really matters is the soul, the immaterial part. So I think that's sort of a version of classic Gnosticism, if not in name, then in belief.
If you're not up on your 2nd century AD philosophy, a quick reminder, the label Gnosticism refers roughly to a number of convictions that coalesce together, but one of them was a sharp dualism between spirit and matter, in which matter was often disparaged and spirit alone seen as being of value. But the key thing here with regard to AI, we're presented with this sort of choice here. Do we want to reduce what it means to be human to some supposedly immaterial essence, if you will?
Yeah, exactly.
Or do we continue to insist, no, to be human, you must take into account the body and all that the body entails?
Yeah, exactly. And this is where it's a tricky move to make, because clearly AI is material. Right? I mean, it's material in a very different way than we are, but it lives on a server somewhere.
At a minimum, it's a vast arrangement of bits and bytes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's not that AIs are immaterial. The point that I want to make in relationship to Gnosticism is that the material nature of an AI is just clearly and obviously different than the material nature of you and me. One reason why I think that we sometimes get confused talking about the nature of artificial intelligence is that we're bringing this implicit Gnostic understanding to our discussion. And we're saying, yeah, there's very clear material differences between human intelligence and artificial intelligence, but matter doesn't matter. That's not an important, relevant consideration. All we have to look at is functional profiles or what it can do, or sort of the less tangible aspects of AI. And that's the most relevant parts of it. And that's the most relevant parts of us. But I think our immaterial part is obviously really important. But our embodied material aspect is also something really crucial. And we can't forget that when we're talking about the nature of humanity in the relationship to artificial intelligence. We can't forget our embodied existence.
I think it's interesting that it seems as though there's been a lot more focus lately in psychology on the role of the body.
That's journalist Megan O'Giblin, author of God, Human, Animal, Machine.
And understanding sort of how things like emotional intelligence are part of intelligence. And a lot of that stems from our embodied existence in the world, the sort of biological experience of fear or anger or what have you. And that's happening simultaneous to this effort to create these completely disembodied, very intellectual machines. And there's sort of a hollowness or an emptiness that I find to a lot of the output. And I can never quite put my finger on what it is without sort of deferring to mystical ideas about the soul or the spirit or something. But there's something that just seems really empty and hollow about the language that AI produces. I was thinking about that in terms of the role of embodiment. Like all of human language is really built on metaphors that we draw from sensory experience in the world, right? So when I say like, she's a very warm person or she's a very cold person, that relies on my knowledge of what it feels like to be warm or cold. And even this goes down to, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson did work on this in the 90s on like the way in which language is built on sensory metaphors. Even saying something as simple as like the future is ahead of us or the past is behind us, that relies on my knowledge of being sort of immersed in a spatial environment and being able to move around. And so you can teach AI statistically how to predict the next word in a sentence, but the output that it's creating is none of that more sensory bodily awareness behind it. And to me, that's really what strikes a lot of the output is not quite as human as I would like it to be.
In other words, we must not forget that we have a specific intelligence not in spite of our bodies, but because of our bodies. So maybe matter does matter. Under the broader question of what does it mean to be human in the age of AI, there's a third concern worth a great deal of continued discernment, namely community.
I flew to Holmes County, Ohio, and I moved onto an Amish sheep farm with an Amish family called the Millers.
That's Carlos Whitaker, a social media influencer here in Nashville. After his Sunday screen report notified him that he was spending 7 hours and 23 minutes a day on his phone, he started doing a bit of math. He rounded down and figured out, well, that's like more than 49 hours a week. Indeed, it's like 100 days a year. So he tried a 7-week screen-free experiment, spending 2 of those weeks in the Amish country in Ohio with Willis Miller and his family.
All of our meals were 2 hours plus. I'm talking about breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Day 3, I was like, Willis, how come you eat so long? And he's like, Carlos, we don't have Facebook. The only way I'm going to know what's going on in your life is sharing a meal with you. And so, yeah, just the beautiful things about community, sharing meals, some of the reasons why they don't have screens. It's not that they're anti-tech or anti-screen. They just know every new piece of technology that comes in or they have a question about, they make a decision whether they're going to allow that piece of technology into their community by asking 2 questions. Will this piece of technology bring us closer together or pull us farther apart? And so they're like, that's why we're never going to have TVs. That's why we're never going to have cars. Because if somebody's in need, we will never be too far away to help each other. Whereas if we had cars, I could be in Cleveland, Miss Betty's barn burns down. It's going to take me hours to get to her. Now it's going to take me minutes. So those are a lot of the things that I was learning about community from the Amish that, again, I've implemented a lot of those things into my life.
Yeah. Other kind of observations about the way they do community that's made possible by not having such indebtedness to technology?
Yeah, it actually was very sobering to see how even the Amish are having to make exceptions with technology in order to maintain their way of living. They used to just be farmers, and that was the rule. You have to farm by horse. Well, what happened? More corporate farmers started to come in, and suddenly they could no longer support their community by just farming. So they're continuing to evolve, but I could see the sadness because they're actually getting to the point now where they're like, we may lose the whole horse-drawn plowing. Willis told me, he's like, I think in the next 5 years, we're going to have to go to tractors because we're just not going to be able to do it. So what I loved about them is they are just doing as much as they can to conserve the old way of life that has kept them close together. But they still have to make decisions.
I've so often heard Amish folks just dismissed out of hand and painted as this kind of legalistic people.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, obviously they believe in technology because they're using all sorts of technology, right? But those questions that you asked, what is this adoption of the next technological artifact?
Yes.
What's that going to do to our community?
Yes.
What kind of people are we going to become if we do that? That's
There
the
is.
question, right?
That's the question.
And that's the beautiful question that we all can adopt. We can all ask ourselves questions about, how's it going to shape my character?
Think about that with every app you put on your phone.
Of course, you don't have to move to Amish country to consider the question of community.
You know, I often am fond of saying that the table is my favorite technology.
That's computer scientist Josh Brake again.
We need engineers who actually understand the impact of their work on society, that they can be deeply technically excellent, be well-versed in the humanities, social sciences, and the arts, so that they can become leaders in their fields and have a deep understanding of the impact of their work on society. But there's a tension there. There's a tension between the building and the philosophy. It actually is like two different modes of thinking. And I think what I've come to is part of the thing that we've been failing to really appreciate is that the environment in which you do that is so important. And it doesn't really lend itself well to a classroom to have these sort of conversations, unless you're at a round table having a seminar style discussion. Like that is the particular medium in which the message of societal impact can be discussed. We need to think about how are we creating spaces in which these conversations can happen, where we have space where we can talk about the technical implementation details, because those matter. But we need kind of a separate context, I think, ideally with some food and drink and like some more separate space and time around a table to have these conversations about these bigger questions.
So it might be gathered at a table, good food, good drink, and good conversation, asking what it means to be human, that this might not only inform, but sustain and nourish the art of being human. Here in segment 2, we've suggested that we keep asking the question, what does it mean to be human? How do we honor our inherent dignity, the reality of our embodiment, the necessity of community? Coming up after the break, one final question to carry with us, perhaps to raise at our round tables. What is within our power? Today in the second episode, we're offering a few modest practices which might keep us from some of those shipwrecks. More like a set of questions, some questions that can equip us to pay attention well in this brave new world coming our way. Before the break, we explored the question of what it means to be human, how AI, with its human-like language prompts and its superhuman data capabilities, prompts us, in turn, to consider what being human entails. Last, in today's episode, we turn to the question of agency. What are some specific practical things we can do? Those of us who are not tech bros, who are not CEOs of major corporations, what can we do? What can we resist? What can we reclaim? I'd like to suggest 4 possibilities. First, learn to walk backwards. Not literally.
There's this Maori proverb, which is from the indigenous people of New Zealand. And what they talk about is walking into the future with our backs facing it.
That's Josh Brake, computer scientist and professor at Harvey Mudd.
That metaphor is very powerful to me because we often think of ourselves as moving into the future, looking ahead, and we're seeing where we're going. But in reality, that's not what's happening. We can't see into the future. We can't even really accurately figure out the weather more than 3 days in advance. And so I think that this is a helpful posture to think about as we're building technology, using this metaphor of walking into the future with our backs turned. If you're walking backwards, you're going to walk pretty carefully because you don't know what's there. You got to go gingerly and carefully. And the flip side of that, which is also true, is that when you walk backwards into the future, what is actually in front of you that you can see is the past. So much of what we have actually to learn about moving forward with humility and care and caution is in history. It's looking at past technological revolutions, how that proceeded, what are the questions that we should be asking.
Walk backwards into the future. That is, walk gingerly with a bit of humility, because none of us knows the future. And look back at the past with a bit of humility, because even if history doesn't repeat itself, every new technology gives ancient temptations fresh power. Second, the Bartleby option.
So you might know Herman Melville's classic. If you haven't read Moby Dick, you can start with Bartleby the Scrivener.
Philosopher Joe Vukov again.
Bartleby the Scrivener is this story about this scribe who's working on Wall Street. And all of a sudden, he just starts saying to every task that he's asked to do, I would prefer not to, right? So it's not this sort of loud resistance. He doesn't get up on any soapbox. His boss asks him to do something and he says, I'd prefer not to. And this goes on and on. And what happens is it's tragic comic. So it's very funny, but Bartleby actually ends up dying at the end. So it doesn't work out well for Bartleby in this case. But what happens around him is that the system doesn't know what to do with him, right? Because they're like, oh, this guy, he's at work, right? He just won't do anything. What do we do with this guy? And that's the option I'm thinking about in my personal life as a way of quietly resisting not just AI integration with it, but just technological integration more generally, is finding small areas in my life where I can take the Bartleby option and saying, I could do that. And in fact, I don't think as an ethicist, there's anything intrinsically wrong with taking this into my life. But you know what? I'd prefer not to. A couple of examples. I spend a lot of time, way too much time in Chicago traffic. I live in the suburbs and work in the city. So it's a lot of time in traffic. And I've really tried, because of the GPS example, saying, you know what? I could use my GPS and my GPS would let me avoid rush hour traffic a little bit better, but I prefer not to. I'm not going to turn it on. And what does that lead to? I hope that it leads to me being more engaged with the city where I live in. It also comes with losses. I sometimes get stuck in traffic on the Eisenhower. I prefer not to spend my evenings watching TV every night. So instead, I'm going to just sit around and read a book tonight. In some ways, it sounds kind of silly, but I think that just as a lot of the problems with artificial intelligence and modern tech are cumulative, and before we know it, we sort of left all this humanity behind, is that I think the Bartleby option gives us a starting point for reclaiming some of that. And even those little steps, just as the negative effects are cumulative, my hope is that the positive effects are cumulative, and that these small choices, turning off the GPS, turning off the phone, literally turning off the internet at home. We haven't quite gotten there yet, but I really want to say no Wi-Fi. I'm literally turning it off at 6 p.m. But things like that, the more times that we're able to take the Bartleby option and just say, no, I'd prefer not to.
Third, we need to have more conversations about what AI is now making possible and what it is now making impossible.
I really like Andy Crouch's innovation bargain framework, which basically has kind of these 4 questions about technology, which is now you can, now you no longer have to, now you cannot do, and now you must do.
That's Josh Brake, computer scientist and professor at Harvey Mudd.
Basically, the way that he frames these, and I like to kind of put these in a 2x2 diagram so that you have on the one axis the freedom versus limitation. Technology always gives you more freedoms. It enables you to do new things. And it also has what Ursula Franklin would call foreclosing aspects. There are certain things that it opens up, and there are certain things that it closes down. You have another axis, which is talking about whether these are new freedoms that are being imposed or new limitations that are being imposed upon you. And so if you think about those axes, I find this a very helpful way to think about technology. What are the things that the technology is enabling that are new things that you're able to do? If you think about something like the smartphone, right, or a social media platform, it's like now you no longer have to be at your desk or your computer to be able to answer your emails. Normally, the Silicon Valley pitch, that's it. We only talk about the new affordances, the new enabling aspects. But if you look below the horizontal axis at the limitations, it's not only now you can and you no longer have to, but now you cannot do something else. So for instance, if you think about something like the smartphone, there's a lot of things now in modern life in the United States of America that you are required to have a smartphone to do. You cannot do it any other way.
As someone who does not use a smartphone, I know this, and it's increasingly difficult.
That's right.
And it's quite annoying.
Yes, because you are now in the 0.00001% probably that doesn't have a smartphone. And so there are things now that are closed off to you in modern life or very difficult to do because you don't have this technological innovation. But the really sinister quadrant is the active limitation, which is you are being compelled to do a certain thing. And so now, because you are living in a society that has a smartphone, you're actually compelled to do a set of things because you have that thing.
Years ago, I chose to exercise the Bartleby option. I quit using a mobile phone of any type. Now, watching from the outside, it does seem to me that those who do have smartphones are, as Josh says, compelled to do things that I am not compelled to do, like be continuously reachable and always interruptible, to be often distracted, to manage an inordinate number of messages and notifications, and to navigate institutions, whether restaurants, airlines, schools, workplaces, even churches and governments, which assume the presence of the smartphone. Am I often inconvenienced? Absolutely. But so are all my smartphone-bearing friends, just in markedly different ways. Surely, a similar set of concerns should be considered with regard to AI. Fourth, be a good jig.
It can always feel a little bit out of control, that everything's just happening to us and that we're actually just, experiencing this and we're going to have to deal with it. And of course, you can't be naive. That is true.
That's Scott Dorley again with his co-author Carissa Carter, their book, Assembling Tomorrow.
We're the ones who experience the impacts. We're far more expert on what this is doing to us, all these new technologies, than even the people creating them, who are very excited and kind of almost clouded by the potential that they have. So one is to say, the feelings that you have, you should express them, share them just in conversation with people so we can collectively have discussions about what we want to do, what we don't want to do, what our sense of purpose is, not just what the measurements and the goals are. And then two is to know that actually, if you think about it, we're all creating the future. If you're a teacher, you're contributing to the future. If you're a parent, you're contributing to the future. If you're a leader of business, you're contributing to the future. If you're a craftsperson, you're contributing to the future. We live in the present, but the present creates the future. And so even the smallest changes at a grand scale can have a huge impact. So we actually do have more influence, maybe not over what technology is coming to be, but definitely over how we want to put it to use.
I'll add, one of our big takeaway messages is we say, be a good jig.
A jig is a simple tool. It holds something steady so that thing can be worked on, shaped, formed. Here they use the jig as a human metaphor, that sometimes the real work is to become the kind of person, teacher, leader, or friend who helps hold things in place so something good can be formed. To be a good jig is to exercise your influence to create the conditions in which wiser action, better work, better futures become more possible.
Be a good jig of the world. How you ask questions of what's happening is important. How you react, your emotional response, the fact that you might acknowledge what that monster is. That's all ways that you are being a good jig about what's around you. Even if you are not the technologist, we need you and your insight and your lens as a parent, as somebody that plans meetings, as somebody that was elected to town council. We need you questioning even the most technical of our technologies. Even if you don't feel like you're the coder, you gotta be talking about what that code can and might do for the realm that you work in, that that is really, really important.
So rather than simply asking whether you're going to use the latest large language model, a better question might be this: how, given the role I have, can I help create a culture shaped by better questions, steadier judgment, and a clearer sense of what these tools are for. We don't control the whole system. It's not clear anybody does. But we are not powerless. We can still help hold things steady long enough for something wise and good to take shape. In part 1, we trace some of the shipwrecks lurking in the age of AI around tools, desire, money, and power. In part 2, we turn to a more practical question: how do we live well amid such potential storms? At the very least, it means this: to keep asking why and to what end, to keep asking what it means to be human, and to take responsibility for what is still within our power. And, as it turns out, all of that is undoubtedly part of what it means to live a good life. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to No Small Endeavor and the second episode in our two-part series, The Human Cost of AI. Please also note that on our podcast, you can get full, unabridged interviews with the guests in this series: Josh Brake, Ruben Chowdhury, Joe Vukov, Rosalind Picard, Baratunda Thurston, Carlos Whitaker, Garrett Graff, Megan O'Giblin, and Carissa Carter with Scott Dorley. And our thanks to all of them for their expertise. A special thank you to the Institute for Faith and Learning at Baylor University for helping make this series on AI possible. We gratefully acknowledge the support of Lilly Endowment Incorporated, a private philanthropic foundation supporting the causes of community development, education, and religion. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.